All right, it's 3 o'clock. Let's go ahead and get started. This is the November meeting of the Knoxville Transportation Authority. To get us started, Mr. Lawhorn, we need a determination of a quorum.
We have 6 members present. We do have a quorum.
Very good, thank you. Thank you, Ms. Valentine, for sending out the minutes from the previous meeting. Is there any discussion or questions about October's meeting minutes? If not, I'll entertain a motion to approve those minutes. Thank you. And the second? Seconded. Any discussion around the October minutes? All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed? All right, we have approved minutes. Reports. I don't have any comments today, but I do applaud the CAT staff for the implementation and launch of mobile ticketing. Thank you for that. I've already talked to a few people who have used it and good reviews so far. Maybe Director Thorne, you can go into that in a few minutes. We do have a guest planned for old business later in the agenda, but in the meantime, are there any other commissioner comments?
I would just second the mobile ticketing thing. I think it's wonderful. I'm glad we have it. I've been posting on all of my social media to everybody, hey, just so you know, we're in the 21st century now. You can buy your tickets, via your phone and pay with your phone. And all of my friends that I've told are not only excited, but it's honestly for them like kind of a game changer. They're like, oh, I might ride the bus now. So thank y'all.
That's awesome. Any other comments? If not, okay. Seeing none, we'll move on to staff.
Yeah, thank you. I just have a few comments. One, mentioning the launch of mobile ticketing, which we did last Wednesday, November 8th. So far, very, very successful. I want to thank staff for all the heavy lifting that has been done to try to get this launched, and we've had a lot of starts and stops. So happy that it's launched. So far, I think it's been a big success. We've heard a lot of positive comments from both customers and our operators that the ease of use has been great. So more things to come with that and with mobile ticketing. Secondly, just mention our workforce shortage and how we're addressing that. As I mentioned last meeting, we had a big class. We hired in an additional 15 operators. We're at about 43 operators right now that are in various stages of training. Some of those operators will come out of training the first week of December. So every month we plan on hiring another CDL prep class of about 15 to address our workforce shortage. Which brings me to the next topic, and I sent an email out to the board about this, and that's our service changes. We want to add back service. Our plan is to bring an agenda item to add back service effective in March or April of this year, where a lot of our frequency and duration of service into the night will increase. So that's the plan as of now. Those are all my comments.
On to TPO Transit, Mr. Burton.
I don't have anything this month, thank you.
Okay, thank you. We don't have any items under new business, but as I mentioned, we do have an agenda item for old business. And I think we're expecting a guest. Maybe Commissioner Durham, would you like to introduce the guest when he joins, or go ahead and give a prelude maybe to?
Yeah, I'll go ahead and give
that?
a prelude because
Okay.
I'm texting him right now just to make sure he can come on.
Okay.
But basically, back when I was in Charlotte in June for that Congress for the New Urbanism Conference, I met this gentleman. His name is Tony Jordan. He is the president of a nonprofit called the Parking Reform Network. They're based out of Seattle, and they've worked with dozens and dozens of cities across the United States. They've actually got a very handy map on their website that shows what cities have dealt with parking mandates, whether that's a total removal or things like, how we've got the reduction within a transit corridor. But I'd reached out to him just asking if he wouldn't mind via Zoom giving us just a brief kind of 101 presentation on, parking minimums and maximums and mandates and how they can affect cities in general, transit and things like that. So hopefully after he gives his presentation, I also told him that, to hang around for some possible Q&A. So again, he's graciously agreed to. Hopefully we can get him up, but I'm very excited about it so that hopefully we can, all, learn more about this issue, especially as it relates to transit.
Okay. Well, we'll be patient, maybe take a break for a few minutes and wait, if that's okay. I see Cheryl Ball in the audience as well. Cheryl is the city's chief policy officer. So maybe after the presentation, if Ms. Ball, if you'd like to speak or have comments related to that, or if anybody on the commission has questions for the city related to housing, parking, transit, we have Cheryl here to weigh in. So for now, we'll pause for a second and wait for Mr. Jordan.
Hello, is this working?
Hello, Mr. Jordan. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Excellent. We've got you loud and clear. We can see you.
Awesome.
Thanks for joining us. My name is Tommy Smith. I'm the chair, but I've asked Commissioner Durham, who's invited you as our guest, to maybe give you a brief introduction, and then the commissioners are anxious to hear your presentation and maybe follow with some questions.
Absolutely. Great to be here.
Commissioner Durham?
Yeah, so again, this is Tony Jordan with the Parking Reform Network, whom I met back in June in Charlotte and talked to folks from him and his organization. And their whole spiel is, parking mandates and dealing with how to update and upgrade those to help cities more effectively function. So I'll let you take it away, Tony.
Great. Let me see if I can make sure I can share my presentation here. Okay. Looks like you guys can see that. Great. Okay. Let me make sure I can move. So yeah, thanks a lot. Yeah, I'm Tony Jordan. I live in Portland, Oregon. I've been doing parking reform advocacy for a while. Actually, I'll get some of this in some of my slides. But I've been doing this I got into this issue in 2010, and I'm just really passionate about letting people know how these mandates came about and the harm they cause. And so, yeah, this is a pretty quick presentation that I adapted for y'all. And so here we go. It's called People Over Parking. Okay, so real quick, Parking Reform Network is a 501c3 organization. It's community-based. It's really people and organizing principles around letting people know the impact and kind of arbitrariness nature of parking mandates, but also promoting other strategies to manage curb parking. And it's not just getting rid of mandates, basically. We produce a number of research products to support our and advice and materials to support our cause, basically, including a map that shows where cities have changed their parking mandate policies, and we have a booklet on parking benefit districts and other things. And we're really focused around taking action and educating the public and helping people just to deal with the issues that come up when you want to reform your parking policy. This is a little bit Just a warning, if you haven't heard about the parking mandates before, you haven't really understood how much they impact things, this could change your life. I was not a parking reformer before I read the book, The High Cost of Free Parking, and here I am now. It's kind of like when the protagonist in They Live puts on these glasses and sees the world in a different way. It's pretty hard to not see it. I now look at parking lots and garages and see just empty spaces. Well, not empty, see empty spaces, but see money that's spent on those facilities. See the ghosts of what was in those spaces before they were turned into parking lots and garages, and see the promise of what could be there in the future. So why is parking? Why do we care? Why do I care about parking? Why should we care about parking? And I think that it really is important because it's something that few think about critically, but impacts so many aspects of our cities and our lives. It impacts housing costs, it impacts our traffic and how we get around, it impacts our environment in many ways. But for the most part, we have taken it for granted for 50, 60 years and just kind of assume that if we build it and keep building and requiring it, that everything will be okay. So these things, parking mandates that we're talking about mostly in this presentation, they are arbitrary numbers. You're probably familiar, but I'll just, they're arbitrary numbers that for every land use and every new building that almost every city in the United States has require a certain amount of parking. So let's look at a survey. If you want to start a bowling alley in Knox County or around Knox County, how many parking spaces do you need? In Oak Ridge, you need 3 per alley. In Knoxville, you need 3 per lane. That's one thing you really notice when you look into these is, there's all sorts of different ways of saying the same thing. In Morristown, 4 per alley. In Farragut, 5 per lane. And apologies if I mispronounced anything here. In Knox County itself, there's 5 per alley required. And in Maryville, you have 1 per 3 persons that can fit in the facility. It's just a recreational facility, plus 1 per 200 square feet of other areas. And in Pigeon Forge, 1 per 7,500 square feet, plus 1 per 4 customers max capacity. Now, I point this out because what is the difference between a bowler in Oak Ridge and one in Knox County or in Farragut? Why do we have a discrepancy here? And I've done this many times. I've seen as low as 1 per lane and as much as pretty much 10 per lane in a small area. Because more parking spaces per alley or lane requires more space, does Farragut want to discourage the building of bowling alleys and Oak Ridge wants to encourage it? Or do people just carpool more in Oak Ridge than in the county in general? The answer is, how did they come up with these? They made them up. Back in the 50s and 60s, cities were grappling with how to deal with downtown parking and parking in general. So they built a bunch of parking garages, and then they said, we'll require parking spaces elsewhere. At the time, before there were mandates, developers and entrepreneurs and architects made up, as this planning advisory service from 1954 shows, they just kind of made up how much parking should go in. No one could agree. And as this person says, they would guess a number of stalls and invariably they would provide either too many or not enough. And that was fine, except that these policies got written into code for all sorts of land uses and they've stuck around because it's hard to change them. Another good example here is funeral homes. You want to build a funeral home in the area. In Knoxville, you need 0.33 per person at the design capacity. Maryville, 1 per 100 square feet. Pigeon Forge, 1 per 4 seats in a chapel. Morristown gives you a choice, kind of puts both of them in there together. 1 per 4 seats or 1 per 100 square feet. I've done this. I was looking recently in California. Between 2 cities about 40 miles apart, there was a factor of 12 difference in the amount of parking required for a funeral home. So I'm not just picking on y'all. Really, planners would do better to just use tarot cards or read bird guts to make up these numbers, but the impact is really, and the result is really profound. When we look around our cities where these have been in place, we have places that they're easy to park at, but you don't necessarily want to go to. As Professor Shoup says, these are roughly right or precisely wrong. I look around and see, Farragut, indoor soccer, inline hockey, 41 per indoor play field. Why not 40? I don't know. Like there's just emphasizing really how arbitrary these are. Morristown, I haven't seen this one before. Union headquarters, 1 space per 3 members. And in Woodbury, Georgia, some of my favorite requirements I've ever seen. High school, 0.26 per student plus 1.2 per employee. I hope they teach strong math there. And they have 2 helicopter related parking requirements for heliport and helistop, and they're different requirements. And hell if I know the difference between those 2 helicopter related land uses. Almost done with this part, but just can't stop. I was in North Carolina for CNU with Dustin. We found parking requirements for drive-in movie theaters were pretty common there. I don't think one goes to show how stale these are. No one's building these facilities anymore probably, and you don't need to tell a drive-in movie theater they need to accommodate parking. And in Washaba, Minnesota, we found a parking requirement for a parking garage itself. SeaTac, Washington, a parking requirement for moth and butterfly breeding facility, not for ant farms or worm buckets though. So I love showing those just because the absurdity and the arbitrariness, but this is not really a laughing matter here. These parking requirements lead to sprawl. They lead to lack of economic opportunity and development. They lead to more traffic. They have extreme water runoff, heat island, and I recently learned light pollution. Parking lots are one of the greater sources of urban light pollution, in fact. So it's really a big issue. And that's before we even talk about the direct costs. Parking spaces in a surface lot are in the mid thousands per stall. In a structure, it's not uncommon to see in the mid 10,000s or upper 10,000s per stall. Underground parking is about 2 times the cost of above ground parking. And those costs, they're very high, and they're not fake. I mean, someone has to pay these costs. An example I found here that really shows the trade-offs in our choices when we're requiring parking or even just building parking as opposed to other things is in Stamford, Connecticut. They built at their rail station, the government has built a parking structure with about 900 stalls, and it costs $90 million. It's about $88,000 per car to store it there. In the same town, there's a affordable, permanently deeply affordable, below market facility apartment that houses around 100. I think it was built with about $9 million in subsidies. It's permanent, but doesn't need subsidies beyond that. It houses about 120 people, I think. It's about $77,000 per person. So in Stamford, Connecticut, there's a choice they could have built housing, for workforce workers or people who are below income for less of a cost than they can park a single car at the train station. Another big issue is the space it takes up, right? A parking space is 300 to 400 square feet. So we're really making a decision about, do we want living space or parking space? The geometry and physics is the limiter more often on how much housing can be built on a spot. Rather than the zoning. So there's a developer in Los Angeles named Mott Smith. He says, parking's like pizza. You can sell it by the slice, but you have to bake it by the pie. And so often a developer will come in and look at how much parking they can fit on the lot. And that's a big issue with lot assembly, but how much parking they can fit on the lot. And then they a lot of times they can't even build as much housing on that lot as they would be allowed to by height and FAR requirements. Floor area ratio requirements, because of just the space that the parking takes up. So when we think about that cost, and we think about these arbitrary ratios and the cost and the space it takes up, now I think it's useful to reflect back in and look at how much parking might you need versus how much is being required locally. So I went and looked at the 2022 American Community Survey estimates from the census. So in Knox County, all households, most of them own cars. Only 1.8% don't own a car. 23% own 1 car. 44.7% own 2 cars. So 69% of the residents in the county own 2 or fewer cars. But if you look at renter households who would mostly be living in multifamily housing, for example, 11% don't own a car. 51% only own 1 car, and 27% own 2 cars. So 90% of the renter population roughly owns fewer than 2 cars. But when we look at what local places, including Knoxville, require for how much parking needs to be in a apartment building in the region, we find that there's often a requirement to overbuild. In Knoxville, a studio or 1 bedroom requires 1.2 parking space, so that's about right, but it still is more than 11% of the renters need. For a 2 bedroom, you require 1.25 spaces, so you're requiring more than half of the renters would need. And above 3 bedrooms, 1.5 spaces per 3 bedroom, 2 for a 4 bedroom, which often would be a family size apartment, which are hard to find. And part of the reason they're hard to find is because they're hard to build, because you're requiring parking spaces for children who might not drive. And then that includes parking for guests. It's all over around the region, up to 2 per unit in Morristown, 2 per unit in Oak Ridge, 1.5 per unit in Pigeon Forge. So if you look at, to go back to the census figures, we're not giving people the option who own 1 car, or maybe you would like to own not even 1 car, to rent or purchase a home that accommodates their choices. Fortunately, there's some simple things we can do about this. Professor Shoup at UCLA has been doing this for a long time. It's 3 steps for better cities. You eliminate these parking mandates. You price the curbs so that if there is a issue with occupancy on the curb, for 85% occupancy, and then you use the money to reduce car dependency. This is not, this map is out of date. We're well over 50 now. 50 North American cities, it's not a radical thing going on, have eliminated parking mandates. From Lexington, Kentucky to Bend, Oregon, just last week, or a week, less than 10 days ago, Austin, Texas, another city in Texas, Taylor, Texas, and like 2 days ago, Eugene, Oregon. So this is a thing that's happening. It's building momentum, and we're finding out that the sky doesn't fall when it happens. So cities like Knoxville should mind their own business when it comes to parking, in my opinion. And what that means is the city owns an asset, I assume, owns its curb space, which it can manage to the benefit of the city at large. That means, whether it be allowing street seating or using permits and meters or other enforcement and management policies. If the city is managing its curb in the neighborhoods or in the commercial areas, then entrepreneurs and builders and their customers and tenants will all have the information that they need in order to decide, do I build more parking? Do I rent more parking? Do I buy a second car? Do I rent a home in this walkable neighborhood where I might not be able to park, versus do I rent a home somewhere else because I have an RV and a boat and a car, right? Shouldn't be the city or the county's position to be telling people how to manage their businesses or their lives. The right price for parking is the lowest price that leaves a space open on every block. It's a demand-driven and responsive to demand policy. So you really can't, businesses that are worried that you might not have enough parking. If there's too much demand, then that price will go up, and if the price is too high, you lower the price so that the curbs are still full. So, if anything, usually these policies lead to more economic activity because it increases turnover and access. Some of the things you can spend that money on are improving access in general for people who are using all modes, including people with disabilities and elderly people and children. So you fix sidewalks and build more crosswalks. You add more lighting. You can pay for transit passes, bike lanes, bus shelters, whatever you can think of other than probably building more garages. And what happens when you do these policies? One, nothing. Unfortunately, inherently nothing happens, because the city of today, like Austin, 2 weeks after they got rid of parking mandates, is the same city it was a month ago when they still had them. Cities take quite a while in the absence of a disaster to change. They don't change super rapidly. And part of the message here is that the city has staff, has information. They see permits coming in. They can see when stuff is about to be built and look at if they need to institute or engage the community on parking management or look at how things are going to impact the community. But we're really talking about in any given year, a small percentage of your city redevelops, and a fraction of that will likely be oriented towards people who use a mode other than driving all the time. And for better or worse, we find that, well, I'm going to switch slides here first. For better or worse, without mandates, in at least cities that have done this in the past, Seattle and Buffalo are two examples that were early adopters. Seattle was just on corridors. They had no mandates. Buffalo was citywide. Most of the buildings still included parking voluntarily because developers and business people know that people drive and they're going to accommodate that if they need to. So we find that really it's a marginal improvement. You're going to get more apartments with probably about the same amount of parking that would have been built before in most cases. But the majority of new homes in both those cities that were built would have been illegal under the previous code that had parking mandates in it. So that's my, slideshow. It's pretty short, I think, not too long. And I've got more information. I'm happy to answer plenty of questions or criticisms if you got them. So there we go.
Thank you, Mr. Jordan. Thank you for covering a lot very quickly. It's very concise and very helpful. I mentioned to Commissioner Durham, I attended a local Keep Knoxville Beautiful Sustainability Summit a few weeks ago, and I think one of the members of your network gave a similar presentation, but it was different, so it wasn't redundant for me, and it was very helpful.
Right. I wanted to come and present there, but I couldn't make it work. I was asked to come, and we recommended Caleb to come speak. So yeah, I'm glad you were able to go.
He was great. You were great. So you had your shot. There you go, virtually. So maybe we'll just open the floor for questions from commissioners and staff, for that matter. If anybody wants to ask Mr. Jordan some questions. I have a few, but anybody want to start? I'll get us. Okay, go ahead, Mr. Simmons.
I'll give one. I was just noticing a lot of the stuff in the commercial end really wasn't pertaining to what it was that we discussed. I'm not sure it's even in our wheelhouse. But I thought it interesting when you're looking at the apartment complexes, looking at like 1.5 parking spots for a 2-bedroom apartment. And I wondered, well, where's the consideration for visitability if, because I've got family that lives in a condo. They've got, two parking spots, but if you're in a lot, say a parking space and a half for every 2-bedroom, even if they only have one car, I don't see what about the visibility, depending on how many people are coming to that complex, probably depending on the median age of the group. If you got a bunch of kids in there, they're going to have friends over. And I was just wondering where that comes into consideration when you're looking at that percentage of parking for an apartment complex. And thank you for the presentation. It's very, very good and very informative.
Excellent. Thank you very much. So great question. So in some of those requirements, which I do not endorse them, I was just showing what's on the ground there. They do account for some guest parking, but I think one of the messages here is that they're all over the place. And so, and as you point out, it really depends on the type of housing that's being built. And who's living there. And so trying to plan ahead, trying for the city to impose a specific number doesn't match up for all of these uses. I mean, I don't know how, I don't know, you may not know, Professor Shoup doesn't know in any given apartment how many parking spaces there need to be for visitors. What I do know is that it's probably not exactly any of those ratios that were presented. It's a tough question because, yeah, I think, and sometimes you're going to have an apartment where it's hard for, with less parking, and it's going to be harder for visitors to park there. One of the trade-offs we're considering is that okay in the service of building more housing in a place where maybe people don't need to drive as much, right? So there's a long game here. One of the things we often are asked is, is chicken and egg. Do we have to have the transit before we change these rules? And really, my suggestion is no, because you're never going to be able to support the transit or support other ways for people to visit someone without that kind of allowing that density or those things to be built. So to answer your question, to me, the answer would be, if an apartment is built in an area and there's, maybe on-street parking could be used. Maybe the city needs to manage that, but ultimately, the people running the complex are going to know that there's a need for visitor parking and probably accommodate that in their plans. But I guess it's kind of like there's no great super answer here, because you're either imposing a number that's probably too much, or meddling with the business. I don't know. That's not the best. To be honest, it's a great question, but I think that these apartments are built around the country. People live in plenty of apartments in streetcar corridors where there has not parking being built, that were built prior to 1940, and people do manage to visit them. So I think, it kind of works out. People will find a place to park.
All right. I'll ask a question for now. Well, one is to point out that we do have a portion of our city that has no parking minimums. So it's an area called the South Waterfront, and I don't know if a portion of our city qualifies us to be on the network map. Maybe, I don't know, is it partial commitment as part of that? Surely you don't have to be all in. But I joke a little bit to say, if you want a view of what this looks like, the South Waterfront doesn't have a parking minimum, and there are trade-offs for all of that. And I would say, I don't know, Mr. Jordan, maybe you agree, but this culturally is not a light switch change, right? It may be a policy light switch change that can be made, but culturally it's not. And so I, from time to time, hear 50-50 of, do we need more parking in that area? Yeah, we do. Versus 50% say, no, please don't add any more. We like the kind of direction it's heading. So culturally, there's a horizon where you have to catch up to the policy, or vice versa. So I just think that there's trade-offs, and there's also kind of evolving opinions as to what how to take this on, and your culture not fully be there yet. So I guess is a long way to say the South Waterfront is our case study right now, living and breathing for people to look at and evaluate the impact. My question is related to public infrastructure. So I don't know if you would go so far to say that every city could take on no parking minimums. Maybe you would go that far, but surely there's a correlation between the amount of public infrastructure available, whether it's public transportation, whether it's pedestrian sidewalks. So how do you all, or how should we think about a grading or score for public infrastructure in our city? Surely some of the cities in the network that you mentioned have more public infrastructure than others, and more likely to take on this citywide, for example, or in more corridors, as you mentioned, or associated with certain designated areas. How do you evaluate the scale of the ability of a city to take this on based on their public infrastructure?
Great answer, and great question. And so I just happened to look up, Knoxville is on our map. We don't have the South Waterfront in there, but we do have that your downtown has no parking mandates. There may not be a lot of housing allowed there, but and that's pretty common, actually. It seems like what we found in our research is that it's probably the exception rather than the rule to a downtown area that has parking mandates, which is kind of ironic, because that is as far as at least traffic impacts, that's where people would assume the most problems would come. And in fact, most of our downtowns haven't required parking for maybe forever. As far as the infrastructure, yeah, I mean, the numbers, the cities they're big cities, they're small cities, they're in red states, blue states. I mean, Anchorage, Alaska, Gainesville, Florida, like Bandera, Texas, to blanking on Lexington, Kentucky, is another one nearby, relatively nearby. Like they're all over the place. I think that where cities get in trouble is your map, right? Your zoning map. One, that these are hard to change. You are all on, you're involved in government. It's very hard to adapt. So it's ironic. Like if you look at bank parking requirements, they require a lot of parking, and they seem to ignore the fact that sometime in the last 15 years, most people moved to online banking. There's a lot less need for bank parking. In fact, there's ATMs even that have one or two spaces. Some cities require one or two parking spaces for an ATM machine. I bring that up because it shows that like these codes aren't good at adapting to how your city changes, and they're not good at adapting to how a region might change over time. So an area right now that doesn't have good transit service or doesn't have good sidewalks or seems disconnected is never going to be able to grow into or a change into a more accessible location if these mandates exist in that spot, right? And remember, it's marginal. Removing the mandates doesn't mean that someone's going to go to a place with no sidewalks and build 100 apartments with no parking. It means someone might be able to add an accessory dwelling unit on their property, right? And their property, usually the areas that we're talking about, if you go citywide, larger lot sizes, you can probably put a car somewhere if you need to, right? Or on-street parking is usually not as big of a problem in these less dense areas that are most resistant to where you could make these changes. So I think that I do think that these mandates don't really serve well in any city, and removing them may lead to some localized problems, but it's not going to lead to any widespread issue because one, it's really just hard to build stuff, and people who are building things, they spend a lot of money on it and a lot of time, and they're not really into making a risk of trying to build an apartment that no one can get to, then no one's going to want to live in, right? I mean, and if they do that, that's not really the city's problem, right? Like it's not the city's responsibility. The city doesn't tell, I want to open a coffee shop, and they don't tell me, you got to have 4 baristas on shift because like people might not like it if you don't have enough servers, right? Like we don't prescribe that level of we don't micromanage many of the other things outside of safety issues, public safety and health. And I argue that the parking is not necessarily actually to the extent that it can be a traffic issue, it could be a public safety thing, but there's other better ways to manage it than requiring parking, because parking then just attracts more traffic. It actually makes the traffic problem worse. So the one real good example of why you might have a reason to requiring parking is actually the opposite. So I'd say, I say eliminating parking mandates is kind of like removing the rocks and the weeds from a garden plot that you want to plant a garden in your yard. You have to get the grass out or whatever's there. You have to remove the rocks. You have to remove the weeds. It doesn't grow a garden, right? In order to grow that garden, you have to plant stuff. You have to change your zoning code. You have to invest. You have to take care of the garden, and that's adding your transit where necessary or building your sidewalks. And then that kind of development can grow there if you're lucky, but right now you're kind of cities are preventing any sort of true neighborhood character from springing up anywhere because we're imposing these one size fits all mandates across the entire map.
Thank you. Any other questions from other commissioners, staff?
Yeah. So can you just, again, one of the slides that, stood out to me is the one that basically said that in at least 2 case studies, over half of the new housing units that were built, they just wouldn't have existed if those cities had still had parking mandates. Can you speak a little bit more to that? And there's a two-part question, or rather 2 questions. I'll go ahead and say them both. But one, can you speak to that and how removing mandates like this can help with the housing issue? And then because we're a transit authority, can you speak specifically to how removing these mandates influences, and I know you said it's kind of a chicken and an egg problem, but how removing these mandates can help transit flourish in a way that it otherwise wouldn't if you had required these?
Yeah. So as far as the housing question, that really is talking, and it's I'll look at it myself internally here so I can make sure. Okay, so the majority of new homes permitted after eliminating parking mandates were illegal under the prior code. That was looked at from 2 studies. So that means that in both these cities, in Buffalo 68% and in Seattle 59%, And Seattle's citywide, and there still were parking mandates in a lot of places citywide in Seattle. So, if you have a building that currently under your current code, I think, you require, let's say I want to just build, 50 studios in Knoxville. I have to build 120 parking spaces, I believe. No, sorry, not 120, 60, I think, or something like that. 50 parking spaces plus 0.2, plus another one for every 5 sets. So I have to build 60 parking spaces for 50 studio apartments. Under the code, so what these studies are saying basically is that that maybe I might build 60 units, or I might build 70 units, and I might still build those 60 parking spaces, or maybe I build 50 parking spaces and 70 apartments instead, right? So it's kind of like, but in any one of those buildings, like, they would not have been permitted under the previous code. So the majority of the housing that was built in those cities, just would not have, without a variance, would not have qualified under the previous code. So it led to, more housing being built without those hurdles. As far as the transit goes, and hopefully that answers the question, you can let me know if it doesn't. As far as the transit goes, I do think, like, it's interesting. A lot of times, like, I've thought about this quite a bit and heard from other folks, like, if you're basing your parking mandate reductions on transit availability to the current day, right? That means in order to build a building with less parking, I have to have a frequent service, in many cases a frequent service line. I think you have a reduction in Knoxville for within fourth of a mile of a transit route, right? So but that line's got to be there. And you guys know more than anyone, right, that you need density to support these transit lines, or to make them at least, make sense and be profitable. And we know that the development curve is the timeline for developing housing and things is very long. So you want the city to build a bus line down a road, and then that triggers that someone can build an apartment, and maybe 5 or 10 years later, you're going to get some apartments built, right? But the whole time, that whole 5 or 10 years, your transit authority has to basically subsidize that line, because there's not going to be enough riders on it. If you get rid of the parking mandates ahead of time, you're giving, you're stopping it is trusting in the process a little bit. You're doing a little bit less particular planning, but if an area gets hot and some people build some apartments, it's a lot easier for you to add a bus line, theoretically, down a corridor where housing has been built, than it is to, plan that bus line and pay for it for 15 years and hope that someone builds something there that supports that transit in the future. So I think there's a little bit of stepping back a little bit. One possibility that you can undertake, is a better step than transit proximity, is San Diego did this. You say, if you, as the transit authority, say, we plan to put a line down this road, then that can trigger the reductions or trigger the eliminations in parking mandates ahead of time. So if it's on a route that has a planned transit that's qualifying high quality, then you can allow the building to start getting underway. And the city, once again, can monitor. They know, like, buildings don't just drop out of space and land on a lot, right? Like, there's a permit. Everyone knows the buildings are coming in advance. So you have plenty of time to decide if you need to improve transit on a corridor because the housing is coming.
And would you say that in your experience, cities who have dealt with this, at least have dealt with, monitoring their parking mandates along transit corridors, one of the, fears that I often hear is, oh, well, if we don't provide, or rather if we don't mandate parking along these corridors, that while we're waiting for those corridors to densify, all of this parking is going to spill over into these neighborhoods, and then the neighborhoods won't have places to park, and it'll be this kind of carpocalypse. Is there any data to support that actually happens?
I mean, spillover occurs. In fact, I got involved in this. I live in Portland, as I mentioned. About a mile and a half away from my house is a street that Portland got rid of their parking mandates on corridors entirely in 2002. It took about 10 years for anything to really happen. And in 2012, there was a boom on this street called Division Street. And they started building. One developer built an apartment building with no parking, and then a bunch of other ones did. And about like 6, 7 buildings into this, the neighbors, before they were even online, right? The neighbors got really upset. They were sure that this was going to ruin everything. And they actually fought back with the city, and the city took a step back for a couple of years. That's my origin story, really. They took a step back. They reimposed some weird mandates. They still allowed 30 units built with no parking, but above that, you had to provide some. And the main result of that was that we got a bunch of 30 unit buildings where we could have had 45 or 46 or 50, right? We just lopped off, gave a haircut to the amount of housing that went on that corridor. Now, if you're within 2 blocks of that corridor, yeah, it's hard to park, especially during, there's a world-class restaurant row there now. Like, it's arguably a much better street than it was before. I don't, but at the time, people were really worried. Portland's problem, and in many cities, is we still don't have a good permit program. So yeah, there's a potential for spillover, but there's a very logical solution, right? If the city sees the permits coming, offer or when they reduce if they eliminate parking on corridors, offer neighborhoods that are adjacent to corridors the ability to opt in to permit systems, and if those are in place before the development comes, then there's many ways to deal with it. You can not allow people who live in the apartments to park on the streets. You can grandfather in the existing residents with the cheap permit and then sell market rate permits to the people moving in the apartments, and then spend that money to improve sidewalks and and pay for transit passes. There's so many options for how to do this, right? I mean, so I guess the answer is like there's good ways to manage spillover, and spillover isn't necessarily bad because it's economic activity, right? There's an opportunity there to find a revenue source to provide benefits for people in a neighborhood that are paid for by people who are coming from outside of the neighborhood, right? Like, or who just moved there. So like the existing residents can look at this as like, a pot of gold. Like, this is not just, if you're not managing the parking, sure, it might not be great, but if you actually do take the care to manage the parking, it can be a win-win for the neighborhood.
Any other questions? Well, Mr. Jordan, thank you for spending the time with us. Thank you for the new information. It's glad to see we're on the map. And I really appreciate Commissioner Durham for connecting you with us, and hopefully connecting the dots between parking and public transit and development that our city is going to continue to have the opportunity to deal with. So thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much. It was great to be able to speak to you. Reach out anytime with questions. You know where to find me.
Okay. Well, hope you can make the trip here one day.
I would like to. They're going to have a nonstop flight pretty soon, starting next year, from Portland to Nashville. So that makes it a lot easier.
That's closer. That's right. Yeah. Well, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Great. Bye-bye.
All right. Commissioner Durham, thank you for connecting Mr. Jordan with us. Are there any other comments on this topic, either Commissioner Durham or anybody else, before we move on? Okay. I don't see anyone signed up for public comment. Am I missing anything? Okay. Well, and is there any other questions or comments before we adjourn?
I want to remind everyone, the next 2 meetings are on the 3rd Thursday, not the 4th. We've got a lot of new members here, so November, December, our regular meetings are always on the 3rd Thursday.
So one more.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
This is November,
Yeah.
so
I was
it
gonna
will
let you
be,
catch that
it will be
yourself.
the
Okay.
next one.
Very good.
That's why we have staff here.
Yeah.
It'll be, the next one as well will be the 3rd Thursday.
I would like to, and you all can instruct me on this. Are we allowed to ask people in the audience to speak?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Okay, so
Yeah,
because
yeah.
Cheryl's here, and I would
Yeah.
like to ask her.
Please.
What I want to say. First of all, I did get your message this morning. Sorry I didn't call you back. It's been a busy day. So one of the reasons that I had originally brought forth that resolution last month, which is funny because I was told after the fact I kind of went backwards about doing it, but that's just just, I'm not a normal person, so that's fine.
I may have instructed you incorrectly too.
No,
so
you probably.
I'll take some of
I
that.
probably just ignored your advice.
Fair
But
enough.
anyway, the reason that I did that and kind of went kind of full ham and rushed in the way I did was because, as I'd mentioned, I was concerned about one of the aspects of the city's missing middle proposal, primarily that under existing code we do have a 30% reduction in parking that you can take if you're within a quarter mile of transit, and that my understanding of the missing middle proposal is that that would no longer happen within the missing middle TDR neighborhoods. And so I was worried that with everything we've done with Kta Reimagine, that would hinder the potential for our better bus system. And so with the original resolution, that was the original intent, was to make sure that we let the city know, hey, respectfully, maybe don't do this. So I would like to turn the floor over to Cheryl, because I believe Cheryl has some fun news for us.
All right.
Hi, I'm Cheryl Ball. I am the Chief Policy Officer for the City of Knoxville. Thanks for the opportunity. I'll always take an opportunity to share about whatever initiatives we have going. Related to missing middle housing, if you are not familiar, I'll be brief, but not a lecture, just a quick synopsis. Missing middle housing is house-scale buildings with more than one unit that are between the scale of a single-family home and large apartment complexes. So things like, not exclusively, but like duplexes, triplexes, quadplexes, townhomes, small apartment buildings that might have 6 to 10 units. There were a lot of, not everyone in the room is old enough to remember this, but there were a lot of TV shows back in the 70s that featured these size apartment buildings, and the camaraderie and the community that was really created amongst, 6 or 8 or 10 families of varying sorts that lived there. So these were really positive types of housing we quit building in the 40s, 50s, something like that, across the country, not just here. This is not something that is exclusive to here. And it is something that across the country cities are attempting to address and figure out, why aren't we building them? And our zoning code, not just ours, but like our zoning code countrywide, sort of shifted to really focus on the 2 types of housing that we have, which is single-family homes and larger apartment complexes. And there was a lot of reasons for that. I am not going to get into that. I'm happy to have those conversations. But and so the city we've had a professional expert group called Opticos Design come in and do a study and help us identify what the barriers were, the parts of town that were best suited for this type of housing, and how we could diversify the housing stock for Knoxville. And that started in 2022. It's been, a process. We've had a lot of different workshops about this particular topic, and a lot of community meetings and neighborhood. I'm on the neighborhood meeting trail right now for this week, I think. I don't know, I'm losing count. But anyway, we put forward a plan, and specific to parking, since that's our particular interest today, for these types of units of housing that we're talking about, to build them, our current code requires 2 parking spaces per unit for this type of housing. Well, we didn't want to do that. Since we were going to limit this to a particular geographic area, and we were going to move forward with the whole idea is to be a little bit forward thinking with this, we decided to limit that, to break that down. We are talking about walkable communities. We are talking about communities that have great access to transit. We overlaid the Kta Reimagined routes on top of the TDR map. The geography that we're using is called traditional neighborhood residential, to look at how does it fit? Does it work? And it really lines up well. Yay! Who knew? No, I'm just kidding. We knew. But so we were really excited. So we reduced the parking in our initial plan by 50%. So instead of 2 spaces per unit, we said, we're going to take it down to 1 space per unit. Well, when we did that, we thought that was pretty progressive, and we were getting a whole lot of pushback at that time that was too much of a cut in parking, too much of a cut. So we eliminated the ability to reduce it an additional 30%, which is a normal part of our code. Sorry, I walked away from the mic, which is a normal part of our code. We took that part out because we were already reducing it by 50%. Well, we're going to give it a go. Long story short, we had a delay with our plan, and we have made very few modifications to it, but there are a few that we have made. An extra 60 days gives you a minute to go out and do a little bit of extra work to see, do we want to massage it? And so we have. And so we're going to put that back in for this upcoming plan, which will be
Cool.
going to Planning Commission December 14th. Does that answer the question that you really wanted me to answer? Okay. Yeah.
So if I can just understand or make sure I'm understanding this correct. 'cause
I know, there's lots of
I've attempted to
percentages.
read all the code in the last 24 hours, and I'm a bit lost, and I'm not going to lie. So that means on the website, the third component of the parking standard in the proposed middle housing, section 11.4.b.3 does not apply
Yes.
to middle housing types, will be
Is gonna be stricken.
That's perfect.
That's exactly what that means.
No further comments. Very happy.
That's exactly what that means. Yeah, and we don't have that version. That the website's not updated yet, as you pointed out, and we don't have that version yet. We just had a planning commission workshop yesterday. We felt like it was really important to get past that, bring our team together again. We have a couple things we're still trying to make sure we feel like we have right before we push it out. But we're hoping if we don't push it out tomorrow, or I'm sorry, next week, the week of Thanksgiving, I hope it will be like the Monday following. I'm hopeful, but soon.
I'm impressed you read the whole code and boiled it down to the crux
I'm
of the matter
sorry
very
that you
quickly.
did
It's
that.
very good. It's very good. Very good. Good. So essentially, you're doing what was in Commissioner Durham's resolution and maybe a little more.
Yeah, I think so.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean,
Okay.
and just bear in mind, this is
Fluid.
just the current project.
Yeah. Very good.
We hope to have more.
Yeah, and I think, I for one particularly have appreciated every dynamic with which you have to consider parking, housing, and the trade-offs associated with everything in between that is associated with this missing middle housing that we had and we want back. So everything you pull on one end has an effect on the other, and really grateful for folks like Commissioner Durham who have weighed in on this, and your ability to kind of take all that and push forward. So thank you.
Sure.
Thank you. All right. Any other comments from commissioners or staff? Okay. And with no public comment, we will adjourn and see you all the third Thursday of December. Thank you.
And November.
And November.